Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kemet podcast brought to you by the Kemetic Means of Production. I'm your host, Robert Bashara. Today's special guest is Mark Bingham, an American music producer, composer, musician, and engineer. Hi, Mark, how are you?
Very good, thank you.
So I want to begin with how I came across your music. I frequently listen to DB Radio, a mixed cloud playlist curated by David Byrne. I remember hearing the track Palm Springs by Social Climbers, a band you founded, and I was mesmerized upon hearing the music for several reasons. I found it minimalist and hypnotic in a beautiful way. It sounded like post-rock, so I was surprised that the Social Climbers album came out in 1981, long before post-rock was even a genre. So then I thought this music was ahead of its time, since it stylistically preceded the late Talk Talk and 90s post-rock bands like Tortoise. I tried to look for the album online, but couldn't find it. There was a 2011 reissue by Drag City Records, but it was out of print. So I contacted the label and they gave me your contact information. In any case, I emailed you in 2020 and you were kind enough to sell me the album directly. And when I told you that I thought the album was ahead of its time, your reply was, and I quote, "I'm not sure what time it's ahead of, but have been getting that prognosis on my lack of a career since the early 70s. What's the joke? The early bird may get the worm, but it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. Not whining, just noting the wonder of 50 plus years of music and still maintaining autonomy, and happy for that." End quote. I think it's a fantastic album and I love the cover too. So please tell us about Social Climbers, since that was kind of my entryway and the overall aesthetic of this project.
Well, Social Climbers came about with started out as a two-bass band, and there were instrumentals, there was some singing, and Gene Shaw was the other bass player. And we did our first show in '79 at the Mud Club. And Glenn Branca, I was working with this guy, Glenn Branca, is another composer guy. And Glenn and others had a magazine, fanzine, whatever you want to call it, called Just Another Asshole. So they were doing a benefit or something for this at the Mud Club. And Glenn was like, "Why don't you play?" And I was like, "Okay." And he says, "Well, what's the name of the band?" And I said facetiously, "Everyone in Soho is a social climber. Let's call it the Social Climbers." And he goes, "You don't really want to do that." I was like, "Yeah, maybe not." And then all of a sudden there it was, and it stuck. So that was really a dumb move on my part, but I should have called it Tortoise, and been way ahead. So we played that show, and it was interesting because there were two people in the audience that night that have impacted my life later on. One was a guy named Dick Cannett, who was also a composer and a music fan, like I am in a sense. And Elliot Sharp, another composer, was there in the audience. So I ended up bonding with them. Elliot, I worked with off and on over the years and stay in touch with, but Dick Cannett was asked if he could play with us. So suddenly the Social Climbers became a trio. Dick had a rehearsal space on the corner of Prince and Mercer underneath Finelli's Bar, Soho Landmark. And those were the days when you could actually have a good amount of space in those neighborhoods without, being a zillionaire. And so we played a lot, we rehearsed a lot, we did a bunch of shows, we did a lot of work making music for Charles Moulton Dance Company. And so we played dance festivals and we played parties, we played all over the place. And eventually Dick was getting tired. Dick didn't want to go on the road, and he really didn't like being in a band called the Social Climber. So that kind of ended in the '82 or so.
It was all your original music, right? It's
Well,
your vision?
we did one show where, there was an art gallery called the Franklin Furnace that, we were in the middle of this, whatever you want to call it, semi-prestigious art world. I mean, a lot of people that were our friends and allies are, now, live in the Hamptons and, and
Hmm.
they did the whole fame whore, make money thing. And so we got this offer to play the Franklin Furnace, which was, there were only like a few bands that got to do that. And we were wise ass. So we said, oh, we'll play 5 hours of cover music. But we played Eric Satie. We played
Mm,
Act, this 20-minute piece. We played, Duke Ellington, and we played the Archies. I mean, so we went
wow.
yummy, yummy, yummy to, and did we play Stravinsky? Yeah, we played Ned Rorem. So we played 5 hours nonstop. And remember, there
That's
weren't,
amazing.
and we played My Relationship, a Glenn Branca song that I recorded with his band called The Static. So that was fun. So, but largely we played our music, except when we played dances, there was a lot of dancing in those days. And, I was
Yeah.
young, went out dancing, and we would play a bunch of New Orleans stuff but we had a drum machine.
Hmm.
It's the interesting part. Eventually we had a drummer, but for a while we were playing dances with just a drum machine. And there weren't that many people doing that at that point, but
Yeah.
so
That's why it has a futuristic sound, even though it's from 81. And do you have a recording of that concert where you played Satie and Stravinsky?
you know, I I didn't keep all of it. I don't know where they are. I gave them to somebody a long time ago. I had When I worked with Allen Ginsberg, I had like dozens of tapes of him, and I found a tape the other day that says Bob Creeley on it, and it's just hanging out with Creeley, hearing him, and he's talking. So I had all, and I ended up giving them away to everyone. That was sort
Yeah.
of general tenor of things. Well, I need
Tell
this.
me tell me about the cover. It's a striking cover. Who's the person?
Gene, the bass player,
Okay, so that's the bass player.
and the others, two of us are on the back, and it was me dunking on a 9-foot goal that was on East 4th Street between First and Second Avenues.
That's very cool.
Dancing.
So you were signed with Elektra Records in '66, right? Have been a member of numerous bands such as the Screaming Gypsy Bandits and obviously Social Climbers. Your first solo effort was I Pass for Human, released in '89, correct?
Yes.
You have collaborated with many artists from John Zorn to REM. Do you prefer being a solo artist or creating music within a band structure?
Oh, both. The Being a solo artist is more difficult live in these days. I just played a series of shows in Indiana, and I was so excited about it. I prepped. I must have spent 100 hours prepping for it. And it was a big deal. It was Indiana bringing me back there to play something I had recorded 50 years ago that meant something to them and I had totally forgotten about. So I learned it all again, revamped all the music. It all changed. I mean, I couldn't sing many of the songs in the same key, and some of this, it was a band record, but so it was very difficult. And I found it really interesting, the modern situation where you're playing and you look out there and everyone under 35 is looking at their phone and talking, and
Mm,
50 is listening to the music.
yeah, yeah.
And except for the sit down concert situations, that seems to be the norm. So,
Mm,
yeah, so that's interesting. But working with other people is always good because I get to use the skills that I have to make other people's music, work in a way that I hear it and helpful to them.
Yeah,
So,
and I assume you're a multi-instrumentalist, right? You play different
well,
instruments.
I'm yeah, pretty good at a bunch of things, but not so great at any of it.
What has been your musical vision throughout your career? What drives you to make music, and what is most enjoyable about creating music?
I think just doing it all the time is good, and because the results, you never know what's going to happen, so you can't worry about that too much. And just doing it, just getting in there, the whole process where it's not as if I feel like doing it every day, but I do. And sometimes it takes 3 or 4 hours. So when you're a kid and you can do the wake and bake, and you bang a pot of coffee and smoke a joint, and then you're right into it. But that has limited legs in terms of being able to do that, because no matter who you are, you have to learn how to play sober, and you have to, and that's so then it takes a while to get into it. But once you get into it, the focus is great. So I've learned to, embrace the process and just and do my work. And that's about as much as I can ask for, especially being almost 75,
You strike me as someone dedicated to the science and art of recording music, but you have a lot of experience also performing live. Can you speak to that distinction between recording in the studio and performing live?
Well, performing live just it all flies away and then it's over. And performing live is also a process that you have to get used to, which means you're loading your gear. You're typically driving somewhere that may be 3 hours away. Maybe you're driving to the airport and you're getting on a plane and going somewhere. Maybe rarely it's, close by. Um, so then you get to where you're going and you set up, and then you wait, and then maybe you have to do a radio interview, and then you get some food, and then you wait more, and then you play for an hour and a half, or play a concert, or a long set, because I don't play that much where I have to play. I don't play those 3 hour sets
Hmm.
for whatever. So then you do it all in reverse, except maybe you don't do the interview. And that's a long process and takes a lot out of you. And, whereas like recording, I'm sitting here on the other side, of where I'm looking at you is an actual recording console. And I have all this old wonderful gear, and I can use that. Plus I can use all the modernism. So trying to keep up with the modernisms and also utilize the great stuff from the past. It's very, very different than playing live. But I prefer playing live now as a side person than I do going out and doing it myself.
Hmm. Yeah, Frank Zappa said touring makes you crazy, right? Uh,
It
he
does.
wasn't wrong.
No, and it's fun, but I'd actually rather go take a road trip without playing, look at things,
Right, right. Enjoy life.
look at things as opposed to, play in some brewery in Taos where nobody's listening to you. I mean, I guess I grew up where people were listening to me. And as that has become less and less of a thing, it's like, well, why am I doing this? If they've got something better to do with their life, they showed up
Hmm.
at a place and they got something better to do than listen. It's like,
Hmm.
well, why am I even here? So I feel that way a lot.
Yeah, so that's your earlier comment about how younger folks are not really listening because they're distracted by their phones, etc. So, I mean, you've noticed that some real cultural shift where in the past, folks attending a concert were actually listening fully and engaging in the experience. You feel like now that's not really happening like it used to?
It happens during the pandemic. I was playing with a band, like a 4-piece band called Micho's Melody Makers, and we played a lot of shows outside, and those audiences would engage, but they were typically, they were like 100 feet away. So I didn't
Right.
get But the minute, you start playing in these clubs and everyone's up in your face, and really nobody's, yeah, the listening part is not, the shared experience is not there. Where in 1970, you'd have 800 people, snake dancing in front of the stage that were responding to the music. And rarely, nowadays you get, somebody plays a good solo or something and three people might go, but that's about it.
Yeah.
And I understand. I like the Zydeco, that this thing that happens around the world where the dancers, the audience, and the band are on equal footing, and the band isn't a star, and the dancers, you can clap for the dancers, clap for yourself, or clap for the band. So that's a preferable thing, but in the States, that doesn't play out much.
Yeah. It's almost like something of the sacredness of music is lost over time, but
Well,
because people are distracted.
well, if you can go by the thing of, everything is sacred, even Republicans, robots, and fast food, or you can specifically say, well, these things are more sacred. But the participatory thing where people are actually having a transcending and having an
Mm,
experience. I used to experience this a lot, and I mean, you can get this with recorded music too, but um, when there's nothing like the buzz of connecting with, even it could be 30 people in a small room, or
mhm.
20,000 people or more. I never played much more than that, but you know that what it does to your nervous system, it's astounding. It's positive, it's wonderful. you know
Yeah,
and it has to be, but just creating the music itself doesn't do that. It
right.
requires it requires a feedback loop.
Yes, you need listeners and you need to connect with them, and it's a whole experience, right? It's a collective experience ultimately.
And sometimes that happens. I like, playing for dancing. Um, but with a recorded music that happens. And I remember when there were REM songs that were being played around the world, and I swear I could feel it.
Hmm.
You feel people in Bombay dancing to the remix with tablas on it.
Hmm.
And that's, it's wacky, but it is, if we're all tied in and we're all a bunch of molecules floating around in a rock, it makes sense.
Well, that's funny because I'm Egyptian. I'm from Egypt. I grew up there, and actually, so the first time I heard REM was in Egypt, and you know, it still had a great impact on me as an Egyptian. So yeah, there's a universality to the music language that makes it really special. I believe that deeply.
Oh, yes.
Um, I wanted to ask you, since I mentioned the DB radio reference earlier, were you aware of this? That David Byrne featured your track, and how did you feel about it?
I've known him for a long time, but I haven't been in touch with him for 20 years. And occasionally he'd call me and say, "Oh, well, can you listen to this thing that I just, uh, it's it's a really great arranger. I want to see what you thought of this." I'd be like, "Okay, sure." And so then a year would go by and I'd hear from him again, but
Yeah.
uh, it was, I remember in the early 80s, I was in Los Angeles when they were working on the Stop Making Sense, and they used to run around.
Mm-hmm.
We would go to the movies, go eat rice pudding. I took him and his wife, then Bonnie, was to the Forrest Ackerman Science Fiction Fantasy Museum, and David walked in and tripped on a glass uh, table and almost broke this thing.
Wow.
His entrance, so a Jerry Lewis entrance, but and I remember going to see the Meters, and okay, now to me, Remain in Light and those era Fear music, that's some of the greatest. I mean, there's not a lot of music that's in the pop music world that I think of in terms of Duke Ellington and
Hmm.
or Beethoven. But I mean, how those four people are, and plus, how they did that, I don't know. It's so astounding, and it remains astounding to this day. And then to me, what really blew my mind is David really didn't know the meters when he did all that.
Yeah.
How could you? So yeah. So
Maybe because they were artists that were making music and they were thinking outside the box. They weren't musicians making music necessarily. I mean,
I
that's
don't
part of
know.
it, right?
I don't know, but I mean, Jerry was a musician for sure. I mean, Jerry, all those kind of bands need one musician.
Right. Right.
Dave-
At least.
David now is a really good musician. 40
Yes.
years later, he can play, When You Wish Upon a Star in fancy chords.
Yeah.
He had
And
to do the cowboy chords when he was making all that great music just doing cowboy chords. That's
mhm. And I mean, I think what I appreciate about him too is he has an eclectic taste in music. So when I listen to his radio show, he introduces me to a lot of music from around the world. So he's really curious, you know.
Definitely. And that was, I think that's how, we bonded over that and other things. But, it's like when somebody's on the level like that, I don't, go, want to hang out with them or something. You know what I mean? It's like
Right.
he's David Byrne. The hell do I do? You know what I mean? It's like
But he's saying that he loves your music, so that must feel good though. He's featuring your work.
I like that. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I know you were also part of the post-punk music scene in Bloomington, Indiana, alongside like MX80 Sound and other experimental rock groups. What was that scene like back then in the 70s?
Well, we should never forget in 2023 that the main reason there was all that creativity in the 60s and 70s is that for musicians say we could make $100 for a gig and our rent was 75 a month.
Mm,
So having
wow.
freedom to rehearse all the time, hang out, go to the movies, read books, and not have to beat the
Mm,
streets to make a buck and not have our rent half of our income, very different. So MX80 say came out of that. MX80 were in the Screaming Gypsy Bandits, and then Bruce and Dale started splitting off, doing their own stuff. And I sang. I played gigs as part of MX80 early on and produced the first 5 records or whatever it
mhm.
was. And so I remained, and I just saw Dale in Bloomington a month ago. So it's still. But the situation, imagine it's a college town. You've got all this space to do music, and there's no place to play because none of the bars would hire any of us. Screaming Gypsy
Mm,
could open on a tour for Sly and the Family Stone, but we could not get a job at a bar in Bloomington
interesting.
because there was, I can't remember, it was 18 or 21 to drink, but the bar owners wanted straight up cover music, and
Right.
they the original band, so we'd have to play in the library or make our own gigs. And Scream Gypsy Man has played a lot of gigs in high school cafeterias. And Dale reminded me this time in Bloomington that we played at a Bloomington high school dance, and the hipster kids had brought us in, and the rest of the kids hated us, and they actually threw rocks at us on stage,
Wow.
and they continued to throw rocks at us as we got in our van and got out of the parking lot. So I forgot that night.
That's crazy. But yeah, it must have been lots of creativity, but that's a good point. Like the material conditions, right? Like today, the recession after COVID and rent being very high. Imagine being an underground musician today, and trying to make it.
Yeah, yeah.
So tell us about your journey of starting indie labels such as Barbecue Records and recording studios like Boiler Room and Piety Street Recording. What was the philosophy behind these initiatives and what did you aim to achieve through them?
I think because I had no clue that my experience was unusual. I wrote a bunch of songs and I got signed up by a record label. Seemed normal to me. You know, Loudon Wainwright was a neighbor and he got signed up, and these other people was like, ah, yeah, this is what we do. And then slowly, you know, it took me like a while, but so I got thrown right into the fire, being a errand boy for all these people in Los Angeles and whatnot. And once I saw what that business was really like, I was like, I don't want to do that, but I still wanted to make records and whatnot. And I loved the recording process. So when I got to Indiana, I kept wanting to record. And there was a great drummer there who had a recording studio, a guy named Jack Guilfoyle. And Jack had the largest African drum collection in America. And his main gigs were Henry Mancini, Nancy Wilson, and Johnny Mathis.
Mm.
Great, you know, for that day, great gigs in a world that I was not very familiar with. But Jack encouraged us to record, and essentially he gave us time to learn to do it. And there was a woman in town who was the heir to the Eli Lilly fortune. She kind of backed the label to the extent of she gave Jack Guilfoyle $1,000 every month, and we got all the downtime. Anytime that he didn't have booked, we could work. And he was probably booked 40 hours a month. Gave you a lot of time.
Wow.
So I sort of, in my vision of it's all music, I started recording every possible thing, all the local bands, the rock bands, the jazz bands. And then we started putting that out. We first started putting out the Screaming Gypsy Bandits, but in the meantime, we were putting out all kind of other stuff. And guy Bob Lucas. So it was about like getting this good music out in the world, because at that point, say, now you've got something like the Rolling Stone magazine controlled. There were 2 or 3 magazines, and there were some fanzines, but I believe the Rolling Stone was sort of like, you know, Fox News for the music industry.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that Roger Ailes imitated Jan Wenner. Said, we need something like that, you know, and the rest is history. But it was kind of like, if you weren't part of that action out of Los Angeles or New York, or the controlling big record labels, then, you know, Rolling Stone, and we would get stuff in Downbeat and this and that. So, oh, this is great. But, you know, it was looked upon, if you had an indie label, it meant you just weren't good enough. Big label. And that was the general tenor of those things, as we learned the hard way. And we had a couple of hits and went out of business because when we started pressing records and giving them to distributors, they never paid us. Probably still can't get a phone in Indiana, you know, but
But in a sense, I mean, it sounds like you were an anthropologist in a way, like you were documenting the culture, and if you didn't archive it, we wouldn't have those records and we wouldn't know what that creative scene was like.
Well, that's true. And then, I mean, there was another guy in town doing all these young punk bands, and we'd help him. It was called Gulcher Records. It had the Gizmos and the Panics, and then he put out a bunch of stuff. And there was a point where there were a lot of these compilation records came out, but the Berserkly Records and Barbecue were among the first 2 or 3 where local scenes were being documented on vinyl.
Yeah. So it's like probably one of the earliest indie music labels, right? In history.
Well, there were a lot of indie music labels in the 50s and 60s that did music, but they were tied into trying to make hits.
Right.
We were not tied, you know, because if you ever tried to deal with that world, you know, a short version of this, of how the world works, would be, a friend of mine went to prison for, you know, drugs, weed. Down the hall was one of the capos of one of the big families in New York. those two guys became friends during the time in prison. The capo decides, he said, "Oh, you're in the music business. I want to help you." Guy says, "Oh, no, I'm good." "Oh, no, let me help you." 6 months go by. Finally, the guy says, "Okay, yeah, well, my sister is doing all this and that." And say, "Oh, give me your number." So week later, the sister gets a call from Tommy Mottola. And then the dude, Bob, somebody that made the Jackson's video where Michael's hair went on fire. Anyway, that's how the music business worked.
Mm, mm. Right, right.
Those of us that weren't participating on that level were not wanted or whatever. So it was, yeah. And
Right. So can you tell us about how you got into music and what music you were listening to, early on that blew your mind or influenced you? And yeah.
Monk, my dad took me to see Monk, and that blew my mind.
Mm,
From early on with transistor radio era in 1955, I got one, I think. So it means I was 6 and I started, and you could hear all kind of great music on the radio then. And I just was absorbing all of it. And I remember the first things that really blew my mind were the Everly Brothers. I don't know what year they even came out, but before that, the Fats Domino and Little Richard, and that world just totally tore me up. So and then oddly enough, I love Johnny Mathis. My parents listened to that a lot. And I heard a lot of symphonic, music, not like any of the heavy stuff, but I heard,
mm-hmm.
Rogers and things like that, Victory at Sea, and here, clean the house and listen to Victory at Sea. So music, and by the time I was 12, I was really into it. I started singing. And then I remember the first singing gig I ever did was maybe 63, 62, 63 at a party, and I sang "Do You Love Me" by the Contours.
Mm.
Did the dance that they did. And then from there, it was like I discovered making up songs. And that was that. Once I started making up songs, that changed everything. Yeah.
Did
And
you
I don't
start by writing lyrics, or how did that go? Like, did you have to learn the guitar?
you see, my dad didn't like that I was an athlete, a long distance runner, and I was good at it. And everyone had me pegged to go and do this and try to make the Olympics and all this. And I was, I didn't think I was fast enough. So anyway, and I was getting bored with waking up at 5:30 every day running and all. So when music came in, when I was 17 and people offered me money to write music, I was like, "Oh yeah, let's do this." It's that part, but you know how it's again access. There's some people are born to money. I wasn't born to money, but I lived in a place where there were so many people that had were fancy jobs, were in New York City and were power brokers in their different fields, writers, broadcasters, DJs. And a lot of these people ended up being judges of the local band battles. This is what I mean. I fell off the turnip truck and landed in the middle of this, whereas most kids didn't have that. If I had been in Akron,
Mm.
so that, getting people who you are your idols, or you just think, "Oh my God, these people do all this great stuff and they like me. Okay, great. I'll keep doing it."
I'd love to know your thoughts on today's music scene, especially the underground music scene, since you've been involved with indie labels and founding them. And so what do you think of the indie music scene today? And
I don't really know what that is, simply because there's so much music out there.
mm,
And if there's, 100,000 records coming out every day, and you can look at Apple Music or that stuff, and every day it's just, there's a whole new template of,
mm-hmm,
you never heard of any of them. So where do you begin? So I've been lax at finding new American underground music. I'll listen to on a piano music, or, I'll listen to the whatever. I mean, I'll go on Radio Garden and listen to the stations. Like Madagascar has incredible music.
Mm,
Listen to pop music. I listen to Mali, and the Senegal still has great music. Niger has great music. So I'm more up on all of that than the American
hmm.
stuff. I don't, you know, the American music, I don't understand. I mean, I'm more up with the hip hop than I am
Yeah.
indie stuff. And so
Yeah, it seems like the hip hop is where there's a lot of exciting energy today, right? Over the
well, yeah,
last 20,
people
30
take,
years.
it's more what I do, which is take found sounds and make tracks out of them, as opposed to kids with guitars or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I just did a record. Finished a record for a band from Boise that was really good. And I guess they're underground, and there's a small label up there called Mishap, which stands for Miss Happily Ever After. And all I did was take their stuff and mix it, and they sent it back, and then they mashed it. It sounds like a record. But I know they'll have a festival there, and I see the names of 35 bands playing at a festival, and they're all from Idaho, or in that area.
Mm-hmm.
This is everywhere. I can look at Coachella, and I know 3 bands. I mean, it's like how out of it you become.
Mm,
And I wonder how all of these people know about these bands, because so there's another world out there existing that I'm not part of.
right. There's an oversaturation, as you mentioned too, and
It's a
that's true.
belief, but so loving music and being immersed in it every day means, in 2023, it means you hear about 1% or
Right.
less, so 1/10 of 1%, because you can't hear it all.
That's why I like DB Radio, because in a sense, like David Byrne is curating what he thinks is good music from around the world. And so in a way it makes my job easier to, you know.
It's a great, but how come I didn't even know it existed
Right, right,
out there looking? I mean, like Mike Watt has a radio show, and say I have my Mike Watt t-shirt on, if you can see.
right.
So I'm like, I am partial to all the lifers that I know, and sometimes the lifers are 35 and have been doing it since they were 17, and sometimes they're 80 and been doing it since they were 17. But Watt is one of those guys I like. In his show, he just puts everybody on there
Hmm.
and plays their music and talks, asks some question, carries on. But that's another guy I like, as he can play with anybody. He can write operas. He can go play most snarly punk music, go play with Iggy on a big stage. Really still doing it day after day.
Actually, this relates to my next question. One of the most exciting aspects of your music is that it does not conform to the listener's expectations about genre. So in other words, when I hear your music, it sounds like you're playing with proficiency across many genres, creatively fusing them to produce something new. So can you talk about your style of music and how you would describe it? And I noticed that humor is a feature of your work too.
Well, I learned early on that humor and being taken seriously in rock and roll don't go together. And it's odd, because like Bob Christgau loves Peter Stampfel, that I've worked with forever, who most everyone thinks is some kind of comedy artist like Weird Al, but he isn't.
Mm,
And Christgau has to browbeat people into realizing that this guy's just unique. He's not trying to be funny.
right.
He just thinks it is. So it's me, there's been some humor. I mean, I just I remember Glenn Branca telling me, you can't do all of this stuff and have a career. Why are you playing with me and a country band? I was like, well, I like to play. Well, you can't do that, because being eclectic is the kiss of death.
Right.
And I was like, well, that's the art world. He goes, you're in the art world. Like, no, I'm just a musician. So this has been an ongoing, talk for 50 years.
Yeah.
And to me, I don't really have any kind of genre concept in that
Hmm.
I'll listen to Monk and then I'll listen to a 25-year-old Britney Spears record because I'll think, what was it about this that worked, back in the day? And I'm constantly listening to different things and think, well, why did this work? Why did this not work? Why did people love this? I listen to Taylor Swift, and I think, okay, and I try to do it. But if, like, say, over the course of time, you get somebody asks you to write music for something and you write it and it's completely different. And now, say, I've taken 2 months off and I have some ideas of what I'm going to do now. But it's to the idea of erasing everything that you ever did in your head and then starting again. I mean, you're still going to repeat yourself. It's still you, but I have to do that because otherwise I'm not, especially with that experience of just having to go back and redo 50-year-old music.
Hmm.
Wow. It was emotionally difficult in a way.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, you don't think in terms of genre, you just think in terms of music that you love, and the listener in many ways, I think, thinks in terms of genre that they like or styles, and that's where maybe the disconnect could be. But I feel like the eclecticism does uh necessitate some sophistication from the listener to be able to handle so many genres coming together in this unique way.
That's quite true. I mean, tell me, of all the David Byrne fans, how many, if there's 100 David Byrne fans, two of them can tell you the names of his Latin records.
Right, right,
So it's not just me that gets this. Everyone
right,
gets,
right.
and but they're going to go back to the stuff that really gave them a bump. And just, yeah, if you're not trying to have a career, you can do anything. And I think my career was based on producing records more than being a an artist, but I kept making music. So, T-Bone Burnett just made some great records. Nobody knows. They're like, they sold dozens. There's a
Yeah,
lot. So there's a lot of people that do this music, help other people make music, and then it doesn't mean people are going to listen to your music,
right.
especially when it's so diverse. And I did a concert with on the laptop at the laptop festival, and Joe with a bunch of people playing laptops. That's out there in the world. That's
Right,
really, how does that measure up to some country song I wrote,
right.
etc. So, and why would I
So exactly. So like the country fans just want the country, they don't want everything else, and there's
want
this problem, right?
anything from me because I'm not in their game. So you remember, it's very tribal, it's very cliquish, it's very
Right,
so if you're not in the club, you're not in the club, and there you are.
right. But I think what I like about your music is that it's challenging in that way. Is that, I'm listening and I'm trying to, the listener tries to classify and compare to what they've heard before, and your music is telling me not to do that, but to actually listen to that experience for what it is.
Yeah, this is true, and that's how people learn to listen. But most people grow up listening and continue to listen to music that meant something to them between the ages of 12 and 20, and
Mm,
then they expand past that. But the musicians continue to listen to everything. And but then there's musicians are cliquish too and say, I've played a lot of really odd, out avant music, but the avant people won't go near me because, I worked with REM and shit, you know what I mean? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I have no cred because of that, you know?
That's crazy. So
Like
yeah,
academic,
the eclecticism, yeah, went too far.
because I mean, I study with Xenakis. They don't care, you
Right.
know?
You have
So
John Zorn on your album.
Zorn, he's another guy doing what I do. Zorn is great. And I wish I could go see his song cycle because Petra Hayden singing songs that Zorn wrote with, what's his name, Jesse. Yeah. Sounds astounding, but I'm going to be not in New York or San Francisco when it happens. So there you go.
So I know you're based in Louisiana, a music mecca for all kinds of music, from jazz to blues and whatnot. How does that historic place inform the work that you've been doing and continue to do there?
Well, New Orleans is its own kind of place. And like I look at the music calendar every day to see if I find something to go see. And mostly what I hear is tourist bands playing fake media,
Mm,
trad stuff in 3 or 4 places, and then some like indie stuff. And then there's the uncategorizable stuff. And then tonight there was this place that has, what was it called? Fretless something, but it's ouds. They're playing like jazz,
mm,
and it's 3 fretless string instruments. And I'll probably go see that. And so that exists in New Orleans, but there's no, the avant-garde of music is more of a press related, press pushed genre than for people. You can go to these things,
mm,
people that you think are fabulous, and there's 8 people there. And I used to see Monk with 8 people there.
mm.
A lot of the jazz, I heard all these people that are icons now, and everyone learns their songs in music school, and there was nobody there. They,
Right. Like Einstein on the Beach was kind of like that, right? Like also not many people
oh,
attended.
I think by that time, Philip had a big audience even by then. But there's all the jokes about he. Philip was the neighborhood plumber. Philip and Dickie Landry, who is a Louisiana guy.
Right.
And people can kill me for saying this, but Philip didn't play that kind of stuff till Dickie came in, and Dickie started doing and the rest is history. But like I said, people kill me for making that connection, because it's the great icon Philip Glass now, and nobody likes to hear that somebody took somebody else's stuff and ran with it.
Right. But everyone does that in music, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
kind of normal too.
yeah, it's kind of a normal thing to do, but yeah. So Phil and Dickie were the plumbers, and then Phil drove a cab. And I know this sort of because I had a studio, and then when I was moved to New Orleans, Phil took over the studio for 4 or 5 years, and I worked there a lot. And my bedroom was in the tape closet, so I took up under the 2 inches of Einstein on the Beach. So
Wow.
it's
Interesting connections.
this is not speculation on my part.
So this is my last question. Finally, I noticed you recently released much of your music on Bandcamp, which is very exciting. What motivated you to do that, and what current music projects are you working on?
Well, the Bandcamp thing was interesting because I had 3 different record labels that were, oh, let's do this. And the first one kind of went out of business. The second one, my connection there left the label. And then I was going to do it on Louis Michaud's label, but then it was just way, way too much. The Louis Michaud's label is only Louis. So at that point, after we announced we were going to do it, we went, no, we can't do this. So I just threw it all out on Bandcamp. And that was that, because in essence, you know, I don't know, are there 500 people on earth that care if I live or die, and about 10% of that care about the music I do? I mean, it's so you're doing this music to connect with the 20 people that might be into it, or how many.
Right.
And so I'm glad I did it. It's out there and people can go find it. And from here, I mean, I just finished a Lily Lewis record, which is so beautiful, and I'm really glad that's we got through with that, and then I'm going to do a New Orleans Klezmer All Stars record in September, and I'm working with a couple different bands, and I'm taking all of these, taking all my percussion box and playing the percussion stuff against tempo, and then just seeing what I can do with that.
Mm.
Starting without any pitched instruments at all. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but that's what I mean, starting over. And I'm making piano tunes. I feel like I'll do a concert when I'm 75 of whatever I do in the next 6 months, and maybe not play the piano, but I'll write the tunes on piano, get a quartet together, and play all of that.
Nice.
And then 50 people will show up. It'll be
Is
great.
that more jazzy or more classical music?
It'll be like jazz. I mean, in a sense that, because I don't know. I mean, I can write, classical music, as it turns out, is not all that difficult.
Right, right.
You know,
If you know how to write music, yeah.
there's all, the whole world goes from 1 to 5 and 5 to 1. I mean, it's not like that crazy to do that. So, but on the other hand, it's not my world. I have some of my best friends are so good at that. And if I need to do stuff and make it really work, I can say, what about this? And I can use other people to help orchestrate. But I don't know why I should even do that anymore. But the jazz thing is more immediate. Like, you can play this stuff, go 100 different ways, whatever happens, happens, and that's great. So I'd
Right.
play like that than try to pigeonhole it,
Do you feel there are territories in music you haven't explored yet but desire to one day?
It's hard, maybe. I mean, I've never been any good at bluegrass picking, but I'm not sure that I want to, because it's too fast.
Right.
Uh, I love, like, what they call the Anka music, which is still popular in some places, but it was really popular. And Anka music in America would be like Perry Como or Barry Manilow, middle of the road music that every culture has that. And like the Latin music, amor por ti, amor por, with this. And so I've never really delved into that much, but I don't think I don't know why I would, but I find it fascinating. And I've been in the trance music. I used to play Indian music. I played sarod, so I'd sat there for 3 hours and watched everyone trip out. So I don't need to do that anymore. I played Moroccan hand drums for hours, and I watched everyone going. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff. What am I going to do? The thing that fascinates me now is the relationship between gospel quartet singing from America, which they later, record company guys, put bands against. But first it was just that. And then how that translated to South Africa. And what's his name? Shambalala. That there's a direct link between the Soul Stirrers and Ladysmith. And there's a direct link between Trace playing in Cuba and the 50s Congolese guitar style that became Township Jive, that also became what Ali Farkaturi and Bambino and stuff play. Although Bambino told me his biggest influence was Mark Knopfler. So the cultural cross-pollination is still fascinating. And you can do it on a historical level or a modern level. I mean, if the first giant hip hop song had a Kraftwerk track, what can you say?
Exactly. One of my favorite Egyptian composers is Fathi Salema. I don't know if you've ever heard his music, but he he studied with Sun Ra and was influenced by that. So
Well, I'll go listen to it.
yeah, so
I grew up listening to Khartoum, and that was it. And Muhammad Al-Bakar and his Port Said ensemble. So
nice.
I had a drummer who he called himself Assyrian. I don't know where Assyria fits in that whole part of it. He grew up in Toronto. Toronto and Detroit had more like Arab population than any places in America, I think. It seemed that way because you could sure get good food there. All the mobs I never could eat this food again in a restaurant. I was like, that ain't, and then anyway, this kid could play funk in 7 and 9, and
Mm,
he had all of that going on. So I learned a lot of those songs when I was 20. This was just
wow.
education, and I still turn on those radio stations. There's still hints of that all over the place, although now they'll have samples, they have Doombeck samples,
Right.
not the same, but they're still pushing that, because the curves, that's what I miss. Like, some hip hop will use curves that you would hear in the singing from Egypt or anywhere in the Middle East.
Mm,
And tell me the last white rock and roll band that did that.
right. Right.